Mere Orthodoxy has a brand new website. We've completely redesigned our website with readers in mind. From the layout to dark mode, downloadable PDFs and audio articles, a new dashboard for members that lets you bookmark articles, save quotes to a commonplace book, access your full reading history, get digital editions of all the past journals, site themes based on the church calendar, and much more. There has never been a better time to become a member of Mere Orthodoxy than right now. Through the end of June, get 20% off your first year of an annual membership or 3 months of a monthly membership. Not only will you get access to an incredible online experience, you'll support the ongoing work of Mere Orthodoxy, Mere Fidelity, and much more to come. Mere Orthodoxy is a reader-supported publication. We can do this work because of readers and listeners like you. Go to mereorthodoxy.com today to see the new site and get 20% off your first year of an annual membership or 3 months of a monthly membership. That's mereorthodoxy.com to see the new site and get 20% off membership today.
This episode is brought to you by Lexham Press, who publishes books that love the Word, love the faith, and love the church. Lexham Press is an imprint of the Baker Publishing Group. Our June book of the month is The Pursuit of Character, Recovering the Virtues by Matthew Arbo. You can receive a 30% discount on this title and all previous books of the month by visiting bakerbookhouse.com/pages/Mere Fidelity. You can find that link in our show notes to get 30% off of our book of the month from Lexham Press.
Welcome to another episode of Mere Fidelity, which is hosted by Mere Orthodoxy. My name is James Wood, and I'm joined by one of my co-hosts, Joseph Minich. We are out from under the reigns of Derek Rishmawi, who this week was at the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in America, which is where I am ordained. I'm a teaching elder there. And I think, Joe, are you attending a PCA church? Where are you at?
Yeah, that's my current membership is in a PCA church, but I just moved to Florida, so we're going to find out if
all up for grabs.
Well, yeah, it's all up for grabs. PCA or Anglican, we'll see what happens.
Well, and that's related to the topic we wanted to explore. Just a short episode while it's just us two. Is the idea we're both Reformed public thinkers, theologians, philosophers. We're happy in the broad tradition of what it means to be a Reformed Protestant. However, both Joe and I are intellectually curious, not in a sinful way like John Webster's term, but we like to dabble. We like to read outside of our tradition. I think, Joe, you studied your undergrad at the Catholic University. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. Where'd you do your master's and doctorate? I can't remember now.
My master's was at RTS in the Washington, D.C. area, and then my doctorate was at the University of Texas at Dallas in a humanities program there.
Yeah.
So.
And then I came into the faith in college, as many people know, and then I immediately got thrown into the Reformed orbit pretty deeply. My master's was at a version of Westminster that became a school called Redeemer, which then became folded into RTS network. And then I did another degree at Princeton Seminary, which is another version of Reformed. But then my doctoral studies was at an Anglican school called Wycliffe. And I think both of us also currently read pretty broadly. And so I think what I wanted to discuss is just why do we do that? And then how do we do it well? Is it unfaithful to our Reformed convictions to read this way, to explore these topics outside of the tradition? Is it dangerous? We've seen figures who start reading outside of the Reformed tradition. Is this inevitably you're going to swim the Tiber, or you should read Thomas Aquinas? And can you be a Reformed Thomist, or is that an oxymoron? So we'll explore, I think, a lot of angles on this. But Joe, why do you read broadly, and how do you just any initial thoughts on why you do this, how you do it?
I suppose my initial reflection on that is simply that I do so because I have to. At some point when you're asking certain questions and you're engaging certain things, you go where the resources are to investigate certain things. And so, and the truth is some literature is more meaty than others on various questions. Some conversations are thicker in some places than others. And really, the mind is adequated. It's mostly oriented toward the truth. And I don't mean that I'm, perfectly pointed toward the truth person. Nevertheless, in as much as what I'm trying to do when I ask questions is get at the truth of a matter, truth is found wherever it's spoken. And the Christians, for that reason, have always read quite widely outside of their immediate purview, because the truth emerges, or at least pieces of the truth emerge in many different contexts. And in one of the other, I think, thing that brings up in me then is that part of this is actually that you're keeping in the habits of your own tradition in this case. That is to say that um, it's not just a good idea to read widely in the pursuit of truth. It's also the case that this is the habits of your own fathers, because it's, as it were, baked into the Reformed tradition to be a tradition that is feeding upon resources and foundations that are prior to itself. And the nutrients that it's drawing upon are not dead. They're still living and they're still vital, and we're still drawing upon those nutrients as we continue the contemporary application of the Reform project. And so, in one sense, I've never really felt it to be a tension, precisely because of the Reformed relationships, the Reformed tradition's relationship to sources outside of itself. But then also, presumably, we're after the truth. And in as much as reading widely helps you get to the truth, then yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I love about being Reformed, right, and not only at the genesis of our tradition, which is inheriting broad conversations all across the world, right, of the church from its genesis, and also the idea that, like, yeah, you honor truth wherever it's found, and in the neo-Calvinist, stream of the Reformed tradition, that's really expounded with the theme of like common grace, right? And I think sometimes Reformed figures are better at more open to receiving that outside of other Christian tradition, outside of the church itself. Like we might receive truth from pagans, but
Yeah.
we're more nervous about doing it from Catholics, or I guess maybe many of the Reformed folks would call them pagans. But we're more nervous about that, and but it's just interesting to me. One of the things I love about, I said, being Reformed is also built into our DNA, is open to renewal and reforming. This is one of the things I actually love about my tradition, is it doesn't stultify. It shouldn't stultify in that way, that councils can err, right? And so can theologians, and even whole periods of the church might on certain points. And I think that's kind of also built into our DNA that I really love in a way that might not be true for other traditions, but also for me. Yeah, and as I really affirm that idea that I'm a questioner, right? If I'm seeking truth, it's going to lead me down certain paths, and I need to be open to that, of engaging figures that I might not have first looked to, I might not have complete harmony with on certain doctrinal questions, but they might be exploring this line of inquiry in a way that is profoundly deep and worth engaging. That my tradition might not have, at least maybe in its current stage, might not have plumbed those depths at this point. And so I'm, don't want to live in an insecurity. It's like, well, if I read these, for instance, Catholic figures on this set of questions, I inevitably have to be Catholic. I think that's an insecurity that I don't have. It's just not built into my DNA. And if you forced me to only read Reformed figures all the time, you're going to foreclose some of those lines of inquiry, I think, that might be really generative. And so it's just always been part of my DNA. Oh, the other thing is, one of the I agree that at the genesis of the Reformed tradition, this was part of it, built in the warp and woof of it, right? That but one of my frustrations in the current state of things is I think this is part of my ecumenism. Is I also think that as the church has divided, which there are all sorts of reasons why it has at various stages. One of the dilemmas of that is I think different traditions, they almost have different charisms. They're just strong on different points. And I think we all suffer when the church is divided, that certain of those charisms are kind of, obviously, I think in the truest sense, in the deepest sense, the Spirit is going to work in our tradition. Absolutely. And you're going to be saved in your tradition. But there might be insights, there might be gold from other traditions that we miss out on. And that's part of the reason why I don't want to stick myself and foreclose those options of reading those figures, because they just really might have another angle on the truth that we just don't see in the present state of affairs.
Yeah, that's I think an important point. I've been reading the Apostolic Fathers recently, and it has struck me afresh just what a crisis in the early Christian communities division was.
Mm-hmm.
In those first centuries, especially, and the divided state of the church that we see today was never meant to be its norm.
Mm-hmm.
You see the state of the church that we see today, something that is strongly attempting to. There's a big attempt to prevent something like this
Mm-hmm.
in the early Christian communities, and for this very reason, that what happens is the virtues of the church get distributed in little pools and little teams, and the whole body of Christ working together with the pooling of its virtues and competencies, and ultimately the fullness of man is. And that includes a conflagration of intellectual styles, even in the
Mm-hmm.
church's mental life, abstracting it just to the church's intellectual life. There are different intellectual projects that are all part of the one, as it were, Catholic mind. Recently, we talked, I think last time we were on an episode together, about John Betts's Christ the Logos of Creation. And one of the things he does that I think is a quite Catholic, small c Catholic move in that book is to talk about how perhaps various movements within the history of the Catholic Church, various dialectics, are part of the inevitable growth of the mind of the church, that in fact we shouldn't overly, see just the Jansenists versus the Thomists and these sorts of things, or Bonaventure versus Thomas, et cetera, but
Mm-hmm.
that there is a singular reality of truth which nevertheless is approached dialectically in the human mind and is represented in the whole conversation of the church. Bavinck will write something similar about this in Reformed Dogmatics Volume 1, that in one sense, the church, the theology, he says, does not yet now exist as a singularity. It exists in the diversity of its churches and theologies, out of which we expect it through the Holy Spirit to grow. And so part of that is then not that we then become members of, invisible, non-identified churches. We remain members of visible, identified churches. And yet part of what we're doing when we speak to other traditions and we try to work in as much as that's possible, and we try to draw upon outside sources, is we're actually bringing, uh, as it were, the fragments of the consciousness of Christ back together into the unity of the church, or at least when there's, a real spiritual unity to be had and a unity toward Christ to be had.
Yeah, a lot of those figures you brought up stimulated some of my other reflections. Peter Leithart's been a big influence on me, and in the way he conducts his own theological projects has inspired me. Engaging figures like how we're talking, but the idea that he brings up in the End of Protestantism book, of just like he's praying for the future church, and we don't know yet what it will look like. But if you've already kind of answered that question from the outset, well, it's going to look like this church from this previous century, and it's going to look exactly like that, and we need to retrieve exactly that thing, then yeah, you're going to be very suspicious of what Peter is doing. But I think he's onto something. Do I think the church was received its final form in some era? No, I'm not a golden age reverse utopian. I'm also not a false kind of Marxist utopian of the future that, we're going to build this. But I am trusting the Spirit that he has something in store for the church that we can't yet fully discern. And it's going to look like gathering the various, like you said, the various fragments, not only of of truth that other people perceive, but also bring the fruits of these various traditions that actually are Christian to inform one another. And so I am praying for this future church. And another figure that has inspired me, which is much even more controversial. But I think this is a fascinating challenge that I really appreciated from David Bentley Hart's little book on tradition, which is very provocative. And I can't affirm that book as a whole, of course not. But again, chew the meat, spit out the bones type thing with every figure I engage, and I do that with Hart as well. He's the figure that I forget how we brought it up in a chat one time. We talked about a possible future podcast where it's like your favorite unorthodox figures you read.
Yes.
Who do you always hate, love, read, right?
Yes.
And I think David Bentley Hart is that for me. I always have to both love and hate, but I always read him because he's very stimulating.
Very stimulating. Yep.
And this book, Tradition and Apocalypse, I really thought it was, especially the beginning where he's engaging the John Henry Newman argument about tradition. And I think it's pretty devastating, some of the arguments he makes there. But I think pairing those two dialectics, those two poles of tradition and apocalypse, I think is very generative of like, look, when we carry forward tradition, you want to honor it as much as you can. And you want to perceive and promote a certain type of continuity. But like the Spirit does just break in and just and reshuffle the deck, reshuffle the chairs. There's a quote from Marilyn Robinson, and I think it's in Gilead, where one of the characters in Gilead was talking about Karl Barth, and I'm not endorsing Barth here, but the character says, I love old Barth. He shuffles the furniture around, throws the furniture all around. And I think I always want to be open to that I mentioned in the last episode that I recorded on Cardinal Avery Dulas's book on the Catholicity of the Church. And he invokes Paul Tillich's framework of like the Protestant principle, the Catholic principle of like, you want to hold those two in tension, I think, of you want to carry forward the Catholic form, the Catholic principle of continuity, et cetera, et cetera. But what Tillich identifies that Dulles picks up is there is this kind of Protestant DNA of like the Spirit breaks in and can disrupt things, whatever form you have. I think that's that. We need to hold on to that.
And in one sense, it's fascinating to see. It's fascinating to see that these mixes are happening. I recall, or I don't remember which speech it was from Peter Leithart, but one of the things he was predicting was the advent of liturgical Bible churches. And these were the kinds of things he wanted people to imagine. And it's like, I've seen that at this point. I mean, it's interesting to think of like, the resurgence of classical and even in some cases quite technical Trinitarian theology among Fred Sanders, Mr. Low Church Evangelical, right? You're seeing the movement of low church evangelical Christians in the West into a rich conversation in the church, while at the same time you're seeing the impact of low church evangelical culture on the liturgical church. That's right, and so there was a huge movement. I mean, in the 70s, the Jesus movement in the 70s had a massive impact on all the liturgical traditions as well. And so you see these places where the mind of the church informing the evangelical mold, you might say, doesn't leave it less evangelical. It renders it more evangelical, and it renders it, and God can do rich.
Yeah, the cross-pollination is going to affect everybody.
Yeah, and God can do rich things through that. Absolutely, and absolutely, this point of David Tradition and Apocalypse is just David Bentley Hart the Protestant.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
I mean,
he would never. By the way, if the audience, if you don't read it, he would hate that characterization.
He would. But it's so funny because in one sense, it's like you're the most Protestant, in your principles in some way. Yeah, he's an interesting figure in that one of the things you see going on in Hart, I've been reading some of him lately for other contexts, is trying to say that a lot of the conversations that have historically divided the church, so for instance, the kind of difference between Eastern and Western reading of Augustine, or some of the fine-tuned points of the Christological disputes after Chalcedon, Hart's one of the guys that is going to walk in the room and say a lot of this is the accidents of history, and there is a lot more unity available in the church, in the doctrine of in some of its basic doctrines, than has historically been appreciated, when the Neo-Palamites and the Thomists start screaming at each other. Nevertheless, he does go in this quite radical direction that unity of the church is also ultimately us moving toward an eschatological horizon.
Yes.
And ultimately, that seems to me to be the truth of the matter, which doesn't unhinge you from tradition and doesn't unhinge you from the fathers or to deference to the fathers. What it does do, though, is say that it's appropriate. It's appropriate for us as humans, and especially as Christians who are in the project of repentance, both of the will and of the mind. But it's appropriate for us to have an eyeball on not just our own personal sin and our own personal error, but to have some programs running, if you will, God forgive me for that terrible metaphor, that are looking for ways in which our tradition mediates folly to us, looking for ways in which the past has not quite gotten something right, or we haven't quite overcome an aporia, we haven't quite said the adequate thing yet, etc., etc., etc. There's something intrinsically Christian about that, and that's part of the overall movement toward maturation of the church, and I think it requires something like the exercises we've been talking about, which, last thing I'll say here, isn't to say that that's for everybody in the church either. You and I are talking about something you and I do, given the particular vocation and placement we have in the church. This isn't saying every Christian needs to go out and go read all these books. Like that's ridiculous. But the church as such and persons within the church ought to be those links between traditions and thoughts.
Yeah, I got a lot of thoughts there. And one of the things I want to come back to maybe at the end is like, how do we do this well as grounded within our tradition? I'm going to maybe come back to that. Like, what resources and what practices do we utilize ourselves to remain, faithful to our tradition and also the best version of it? I'm going to come back to that.
And now for a quick word from one of our sponsors. Beeson Divinity School is an interdenominational evangelical seminary on the campus of Sanford University in Birmingham, Alabama. I've been there. It is actually a lovely campus. Led by world-renowned faculty, Beeson forms students in person in a kind of a community-oriented model of theological education, and they have top-ranked scholars who engage their students at kind of very small class sizes. It's a warm environment. And now, thanks to a generous gift, Beeson is actually offering new full tuition scholarships for the 2025-2026 incoming class for their flagship degree, the Master of Divinity. So this kind of makes the whole thing more affordable than it's ever been. Now, these scholarships cover the cost of tuition and fees for 3 years, which is the average time it takes to finish the MDiv. And I'll be honest and say, I wish I had known about this or had an opportunity to look at this when I was heading to seminary. So if you're interested, you can apply and learn more information at beesondivinity.com.
One of the things that I like, the accidents of history and how we've kind of got stuck in a certain set of rhetorical devices, and we haven't overcome the aporias and all these things is one of my favorite quotes when doing my dissertation research, again on a Roman Catholic named Henri de Lubac. I can't remember who he was quoting. It might have been Chenu or one of his other Nouvelle Theologie friends. But he says, it's a great tragedy to learn the faith against someone. It's a great tragedy to basically learn the faith against other traditions. So basically just purely in polemical mode. And I really agree with that, where if you're primarily engaging these sets of questions, these lines of theological inquiry, just kind of purely in that, like, well, this is why this other set of people are wrong, I think you've already kind of set the tracks and you can't break from them. This is actually, even though I love Bavinck, and I think he himself is a very, very kind of small C Catholic figure, I also grew tired of some of the mode of his theological reasoning. It kind of this kind of like, I'm going to set up, here's how the Roman Catholic position presents this, here's how the Lutherans, here's how the Anabaptists, and of course the Reformed is the best of all of these. I don't think he necessarily has that in his mind, but I think that method or that mode of reasoning, I think I couldn't operate in that primarily because I just think it doesn't lead me enough to be surprised by the rapprochement, by the agreement, by even the limitations of my own tradition. It does kind of set up something that I was not intrigued by. It was not drawn to. And that polemical thing, I don't think he's necessarily polemical. He is actually pretty ironic, but I think there's something there still that it becomes intellectually stultifying for me. Another limitation of the polemical mode of theology can be, and where you're only kind of oftentimes just stuck in reading only your tradition, and you're nervous about reading outside in other traditions and what it might mean, what it might lead you to. Is I often think the rad trads, for instance, of the Reformed world often act like we're still in the same state that we were at the early Protestant divisions. And I just think I think you were mentioning offline, we were talking about how what's so interesting about reading like someone like Betts or someone like Schindler, et cetera, and you even brought up Hart just a minute ago, is a lot of figures in these other traditions that we might think are very prideful in their identification of what the true church is. Like the true church is this, and it's not Protestants, and they're wrong for others. You go and read some of the best of their own thinkers, and they oftentimes are the most small C Catholic of, and there are developments that have happened of rapprochement on their side, and I think we should acknowledge that as we engage. Like, man, the Spirit also, it's not perfect. We don't know what's going to come down the pike, and I don't have great ecumenical optimism right now in the present state of affairs. But things have happened in the recent century, for instance, of greater movement towards one another, and I think we should honor that also in our intellectual engagement. However, I do think now to come to the other side, but I also worry that someone who might listen to us here and the type of theological spirit we're promoting, that we inhabit ourselves, there is a danger of, I think, engaging this type of intellectual work prematurely that doesn't also draw from and appreciate the deep wells of the tradition that we inhabit. I think if you start doing the stuff that we're doing and you actually don't know your own tradition very well, you haven't actually engaged the old sources and the best of there is a danger that you just swim quickly to another tradition. But because you've actually contrasted it with a caricature, kind of a lowbrow caricature of your own tradition, and you're often doing it out of a sort of real insecurity of what your tradition has to offer. But that insecurity is not necessary to your tradition. Your tradition has great riches. So anyway, those are some quick thoughts.
Yeah, I think that latter point is especially crucial because very often the path, and I was looking in this Bobbing book trying to find the particular quote that I recall from him on this question, but Bobbing especially says that the true church exists already. The true theology exists already, but as distributed in the true church is, and in the true theologies, and it's an eschatological thing to have it, even if you think one church is, as it were, quote, quote, more approximate than the others in various things, and that might be where there'd be a critique. On the other hand, there's an expectation that the fullness of truth is found partially outside of one particular stream of the church. On the other hand, your access point to those streams is your own tradition. And so, for instance, this is one of the reasons it's there's something good about, Baptists are not necessarily having to become unbaptist to become more accurately Trinitarian. They can reach back into their own confessions and into the grammars that those were, built upon, similar in all the other traditions. But part of it is to recognize our traditions, and even evangelical traditions, already come out of these rich conversations. and to plug back into those rich conversations can be done from inside your various traditions. And then, of course, the question of growth and the question of more radical transformations becomes relevant, but it's not a free for all. You don't have to unhinge, as it were, from your particular location in the body of Christ to connect to the larger aspects of the body of Christ. And I think, yeah, that is very crucial. And so Bavinck's imagination is that, imagine a Lutheran, a Reformed person, a Methodist, a Roman Catholic, an Eastern Orthodox person, the perennial joke. That sounds like the beginning of a joke. But, but imagine all of them simply studying the whole of scripture and Christian history, making the best presentation of things to themselves, and then talking about theology together. One of the things you already see there, by the way, is that is intrinsically already a more ecumenical conversation. So to take something like predestination and free will, a lot of people think this is a big dispute between the Protestants and the Catholics. But on one vantage point, you could wind up saying, hey, actually this entire world of Catholicism and this entire world of the Reformed are not even really talking about a different thing when they are talking about questions of freedom and predestination. And so depending on who you're talking about, even within the various worlds, you actually wind up locating, when you have that level of conversation going on, you actually wind up getting a lot more precise about where the differences are even located, which are often located at superficial levels, and then the argument becomes superficial.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I thought I think we've talked about this in previous episodes. There was great, I could see why you'd be really enthusiastic. Now it kind of feels, a little dated, but you could see why there was enthusiasm with the emergence of like the post-liberal theology of Fry and Lindbeck, of this, where you're it was an attempt to try to understand the other traditions as entire like linguistic worlds where that might not use the same terminology that you do, but they're addressing a similar set of issues with their own internal resources. And it allows you to try to see it from within their tradition. And like I often will talk about this with my students. It's like, this is a really complicated, like the justification, sanctification debates. Like, oftentimes I think we present caricatures of the various positions on this. And one of the things I try to say is like, look, I think everybody who's a Christian, at least what I would identify as Christian, is trying to say this: Jesus saves you and you need to change. Okay. So everybody's kind of trying to say that. And they're often approaching it with different sets of conceptual resources and terminological tools. And I think we can say some are better than others. Of course we do that. And yet I think, hey, sit charitably and look at how this different tradition is trying to say that. And the East, not only Catholic and Protestant, but also Eastern Orthodox with the essence energies and, deification discourse. Like, okay, just try to sit in that and see how they're trying to answer that question with a different set of tools, and see, and then try to judge whether or not you feel like that is the best way to do that. And that's fair. I think then we can make those judgments. But I think you could see how that post-liberal conversation was trying to do what you're talking about. The other thing is, it reminded me of is the way you talked about, like, where your access point to the truth that even is beyond your tradition. One of the things I've tried to introduce to my students is, again, I am kind of a post-liberal theologian in that sense of, a narrative theologian that you, I want to introduce to them the idea of you are always practicing traditioned rationality, right? Like you are always coming into the world and coming into a set of conversations that have preceded you. And there is a tradition, and your access to truth is often mediated by that tradition. However, and so there's truth, but also there's truth beyond that tradition, right? Your access point starts there, but always remain open to kind of surprises and challenges, right? And don't foreclose the conversation because you've accessed it through a tradition, while at the same time honoring that you access this through a tradition. That's one thing that it came up. The other thing is, in my research on the theme of Catholicity in recent years, and I've come across, and this might be familiar to our audience, but the whole world of receptive ecumenism. And one of the things that particularly associated with a figure named Paul Murray, but one of the things that's going on there is it's not just receiving the gifts of other traditions, which is one of the things we've been talking about. But that's been around for a long time in ecumenism. It's like, hey, be open to receiving the gifts of other tradition. One thing that's going on with what Paul Murray's recent work has been trying to do for the last 20 years is also you are best able to offer gifts to that conversation by more deeply going into your tradition. And so one of the things what he's arguing is actually you become a better servant of ecumenism by being deeper in your tradition. And what you'll find is the deeper you go is that actually the connection points are more real than you first thought. And I think there's something beautiful about that interplay going on.
This is a crucial point, and it's one of the things I think you see in certain early missiologists. I think certainly Bavinck and his nephew, his missiologist nephew, that the gospel and even the intellectual traditions of the gospel going into various communities, bringing with it the entire wealth and virtues and conversation of the church, it's not just a kind of spiritual colonization, but because in one sense the spread of the church and the spread of the gospel is the recovery of man. You also have the vantage points that those people have as creatures, as men and women, and that is actually brought into their distinctive and unique vantage points are brought into the great conversation, and there is a way in which there's a relationship between what is particular about everyone and their culture and the offering that's given to the one sacrifice, in a sense, whether it be the one theology or the one act of worship. I did find my quote.
Oh, you found it.
I think it's just so relevant to our conversation that I'll go ahead and read this. But this is in Bavinck, Reformed Dogmatics, Volume 1, page 85. He says, the religion and the theology do not now exist any more than the church. There are only differing churches and similarly differing theologies. This will be the case until in Christ the church has attained its full maturity and all have come to the unity of faith and knowledge of the Son of God. This unity cannot be reached by force, but can best be advanced if each person thinks through the faith of his own church and makes the most accurate presentation of it. It is not apart from the existing churches, but through them that Christ prepares for himself a holy Catholic Church. Nor is it apart from the different ecclesiastical dogmas, but through them that the unity of the knowledge of God is prepared and realized. And so there's this sense in which for Bavinck, there's, the Catholicity and unity of the church, while existing spiritually, are an eschatological end, and yet your way of participating in it isn't running outside of your own house, as it were, but running through your own house or plugging more deeply into your own roots, actually to plug into the deeper streams.
Yeah, because if you jump ship and just go to you'll find the same problems there. If you so you swim the Tiber and you think that's going to resolve all of these problems and the insularity, you won't have that, and you won't have any of this conceptual limitations, blah, 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 or the interminable debates that seem not to resolve, you're going to find it there as well. And so, I absolutely think that's correct. Go deeper into your tradition, but also through that to see what might emerge in the church in the future from that engagement. As everybody's doing that, that's part of the receptive ecumenism task. I think is quite generative and stimulating to me. The other thing I wanted to make sure we cover as we get closer to the end is related to this is how do we also then, as we're curious, we read outside, we also maintain our integrity as Reformed thinkers and honor our tradition. And one of the ways that I've grown in this over the years is a couple things. One, every time I try to keep going back to reading both frequently, to reading old great texts in my tradition and reading kind of contemporary, very important works working very explicitly from within my tradition to be refreshed by like, you know what? Also, the Reformed faith is amazing and great. And we have deep depths here. And so I frequently try to go back to that, even if I get off on these other paths. And so like, for instance, right now, I have been doing a lot of work on the nature grace debates that we talked about. But also I'm trying to, and also I'm very interested in supralapsarian Christology, which often has been explored outside of the Reformed tradition. But also, I'm very much trying to make sure I'm engaging those topics from within commitment to kind of Reformed covenant theology. And so I've been recently reading a ton on the covenant of works, the covenant of redemption, the covenant of, I'm just trying to go back to the best literature on that to try to bring these conversations, these threads together into a single conversation and try to think, hey, how can those other topics, those other lines of inquiry speak into and relate to the tradition in which I find myself? And that's been really stimulating, actually, to pursue those paths together and try to bring them together. That's been really, really fun. And also to be, now I teach at a Reformed institution, explicitly so, and to consider my vocation as like, yes, I'm interested in a lot of these other topics, but I have a sense of stewardship that I need to also be speaking as a Reformed thinker. And even in my classes, for instance, even though I'm personally ordained in the PCA, which is, Westminsterian tradition, I teach at a Dutch Reformed school. And so often in my classes, for instance, I will constantly be trying to bring in not only Bavinck, of course. Bavinck's always, I tell my students, he's always the answer at this institution. Whatever the question is, Bavinck is the answer. But I also will try to bring in the three forms of unity as much as I can.
Yep.
And be like, hey, let's try to work from within this and see the beauty of the depths here. So those are some of the ways I will do that.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good point. I feel like I've been encouraged recently to see theologians working from other traditions and bridging conversations, I think, in just rich ways. So I'm thinking of I think it's Davidson, but partakers.
Yes, Andrew Davidson.
Yeah, what's the name? Partakers.
Participation in
participation. Yes. There's some elements in there where clearly he's working from a particular tradition, but he's also bridging conversations and traditions in a way that has some real rich potential. We've already mentioned John Betts. I can also think of Adonis Vidu, his recent work on the Trinity. I was just reading it this week, but has just a really excellent section on the spiration of the Spirit, and is connecting it to a Reformed theology of grace and wants to bridge certain soteriological conversations and Trinitarian discussions, but very much in direct engagement with Thomas Aquinas. And so what you see going on in a lot of fields are people deeply reading these traditions, but then bringing to bear emphases within their own tradition. And I think this is what you're talking about in this grace thing. And putting those conversations together produces something that's more than the sum of their parts. And that is an advancement for the overall knowledge of the church, and really does over time create the condition of the possibility of real, certain kinds of real reunion. I don't mean that in any crass predictive sense, but that creates the possibility for conditions that aren't these, I suppose you could say, relative to that question. But yeah, I just think there are some rich, I suppose that's one last thing I'll say, but when you see it going on well, it's very attractive. It's the sort of thing, when you see ecumenicity not done in some cheap way,
yes,
but you actually see rich conversations with full intellectual rigor being brought to engage one another, and you're seeing things actually get reconciled by people who care about the actual content of the truth, it becomes an intrinsically exciting project, and it's something, therefore, that the raw human in you wants to pursue. And we shouldn't neglect the possibility of that or be cynical about it in the name of, or because of the the many shallow ways in which ecumenical activity has often gone on in the last century.
Yeah, and I think the last century is, the steam has been, lost in that form of ecumenism, right? And it was shown to be shallow and didn't resolve the problems it set out to solve. But now what's open to us is the stuff we're talking about here, and I think it's happening on the ground. It's often invisible to the layperson who might not be involved in these conversations, but there is a lot of really exciting developments as people go deeper, not shallow. One of the things I love about Lightheart's version of this type of engagement, he's like, look, real ecumenism, to be really Catholic, we should argue more because we're actually getting deeper with one another. But the spirit there is still one of hope, and that the spirit, that the spirit actually might resolve some of these problems through this engagement. So we remain hopeful. And it's also not just to bypass the disagreement, but to get to the truth, you're saying. And I think as we're all oriented towards that truth in its depths, be open to surprise and change and transformation, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll end it with that. It was a fun conversation. And thank you, listener, for joining us again for another episode of Mere Fidelity. If you liked this, please leave a like wherever you listen, review, et cetera, and join us next time. And have a great week. Thank you.